What if I told you that the case that haunts me most wasn't one I solved as a detective, but one? What if I told you that solving crimes for 40 years still couldn't prepare my uncle for the most bizarre case that would literally knock on his door after retirement? My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and at 68, I thought I'd seen it all. Bank robberies, murder mysteries, missing persons cases that kept me up for weeks. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, 3 years into my retirement. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, working on a crossword puzzle with my morning coffee, when I heard this peculiar scratching sound coming from my front door. Not knocking, not doorbell ringing, but scratching, like fingernails on wood. Now, after 4 decades of police work, your instincts never really retire. Something about that sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I set down my coffee mug and walked slowly to the front door. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing, just my empty front porch and the maple tree swaying in the morning breeze. But the scratching was definitely coming from the other side of the door. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing there in a faded yellow dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was dark and stringy, hanging down over her face. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. Wow. She was scratching the door with her bare fingernails, which were worn down to the quick and bleeding. "Honey, what are you doing?" I asked, immediately switching into protective mode. "Where are your parents?" She looked up at me with these enormous dark eyes, and I swear I've never seen such sadness in a child's face. "I'm looking for my daddy," she whispered. "The man said he lives here." I unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. "What man, sweetheart? And what's your daddy's name?" "Detective Morrison," she said, and my heart nearly stopped. "The man with the badge said Detective Morrison could help me find my daddy." Now I need to pause here and explain something. I've lived in this house for 12 years, ever since I moved here from Chicago. I bought it from an elderly couple who were moving to Florida. Before that, it was owned by a family named Henderson. I did my research as any good detective would. There had never been another Detective Morrison living at this address. I knelt down to the little girl's level. "What's your name, honey?" "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Mitchell." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. 23 years ago, when I was still working homicide in Chicago, I had worked a case involving a missing girl named Sarah Mitchell. 7 years old, disappeared from her backyard while playing. We searched for months, followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people. The case went cold, and it haunted me for years. It was one of the few cases I never solved, and it ate at me throughout my entire career. But this couldn't be the same Sarah Mitchell. That would be impossible. That Sarah would be 30 now if she were still alive. This girl looked exactly like the photos I remembered from the case file. "Sarah, can you tell me what year it is?" I asked gently. She tilted her head, confused. "It's 1999, silly. Everyone knows that. 1999. The year Sarah Mitchell disappeared." I felt my rational mind trying to process this information, while my detective instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. But looking at this little girl, scared and alone, I knew I had to help her, regardless of how impossible the situation seemed. "Sarah, let's go inside and we'll figure this out together, okay?" I said, extending my hand. She took it, and her skin was ice cold despite the warm morning. As we walked into my living room, I noticed she left small, muddy footprints on my hardwood floor. But when I looked closer, they weren't quite right. The mud was dark, almost black, and it had a strange, earthy smell that reminded me of freshly dug graves. I sat her down on my couch and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Sarah, can you tell me about the man who told you to come here?" "He was tall," she said, pulling the blanket tight around herself. "He wore a police uniform like the ones on TV. He had a shiny badge, and he said Detective Morrison was the best detective in the world and could help me find my daddy." "What did this man look like?" Sarah's brow furrowed in concentration. "He had gray hair and kind eyes. He looked tired, like he worked too much. He said he knew you from the old days." A chill ran down my spine. She was describing my former partner, Detective James Sullivan. But Jim had died 2 years ago from a heart attack. I attended his funeral. Sarah, did this man tell you his name? Detective Sullivan, she said without hesitation. He said you and him were best friends, and that you would remember the promise you made. The promise. Oh, God, the promise. On the day we officially closed the Sarah Mitchell case, Jim and I had made a pact. If either of us ever found out what happened to that little girl, we would make sure she got justice, no matter what. We would never give up on her. But Jim was dead, and the case was decades old. I excused myself and went to my home office, where I kept copies of some of my old case files. I pulled out the Sarah Mitchell file and opened it with trembling hands. There she was. Oh, the same dark hair, the same sad eyes, the same yellow dress she had been wearing when she disappeared. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was standing by my mantelpiece, looking at framed photographs of my family. "Is this your family?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart. That's my wife, Margaret, and those are my children when they were young." She nodded solemnly. "My daddy always said family was the most important thing. He said he would never leave me, but then he did." "What happened to your daddy, Sarah?" Her eyes filled with tears. "The bad man took him away. He said Daddy saw something he shouldn't have seen. Then the bad man came for me, too. But I hid. I hid for so long, but I couldn't find my way home." My detective mind was racing. In the original case, Sarah's father had been a potential witness in a corruption case involving several Chicago police officers. He had been scheduled to testify before the grand jury the week after Sarah disappeared. Both he and Sarah vanished without a trace. "Sarah, can you tell me about the bad man? What did he look like?" Her little body started shaking. "He had mean eyes and a scary voice. He wore a police uniform, too, but his badge was different. Daddy said not all police officers are good people." I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in my mind. There had always been suspicions that Sarah and her father had been eliminated to prevent his testimony. But we never found any evidence, and the corruption case fell apart without their key witness. "Sarah, I need to ask you something very important. Where have you been all this time?" She looked at me with those impossibly sad eyes. "I've been waiting," she said simply. "Waiting for someone to find me. Detective Sullivan said you never stopped looking, even after everyone else gave up." The room suddenly felt very cold. I checked my thermostat, but it was set at the same temperature it always was. As I turned back to Sarah, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The blanket I had wrapped around her was lying on the couch, but she wasn't there. "Sarah," I called out. "Sarah, where are you?" I searched every room in my house, but she was nowhere to be found. The only evidence she had been there were those strange, dark footprints on my floor and the lingering smell of earth and decay. I sat down heavily in my chair, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was this some kind of breakdown brought on by retirement and too much time thinking about old cases? But then I remembered something. I grabbed my phone and called my old precinct in Chicago. After being transferred several times, I finally got through to Detective Maria Santos, who had taken over some of Jim's old cases. "Maria, it's Frank Morrison. I need you to check something for me. The Sarah Mitchell case from 1999. Has there been any recent activity on that file?" There was silence on the other end for a moment. "Frank, that's strange you should ask. Last week we received an anonymous tip about that case. Someone called in coordinates to a location in Cook County Forest Preserve. We sent a team out there yesterday." My heart was pounding. "What did you find?" "We found them, Frank. Sarah Mitchell and her father, Robert. They were buried in a shallow grave, exactly where the caller said they would be. The coroner estimates they've been there for about 23 years. I felt the room spinning around me. "Maria, was there anything else? Any other evidence?" "Actually, yes. We found something really unusual. There was a child's yellow dress perfectly preserved and a note. The note had your name on it, Frank. It said Detective Morrison kept his promise." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, but the detective in me knew that sometimes the impossible is just the truth waiting to be discovered. I walked back to my living room and looked at those dark footprints on my floor. As I watched, they began to fade, becoming lighter and lighter until they disappeared completely. But the smell lingered, that earthy, grave-like smell that I would never forget. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Jim Sullivan was buried. I stood by his headstone and spoke to him like he was still there. "Jim, I don't know how you did it, but we solved the case. Sarah Mitchell can rest now. Her father can rest now. We kept our promise." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, and for just a moment I could have sworn I heard Jim's voice saying, "Good work, partner." The next day I received a call from Detective Santos. The investigation into the Sarah Mitchell case had been reopened, and using new DNA evidence found at the burial site, they had identified her killer. It was a former Chicago police sergeant named Marcus Kane, who had been involved in the corruption case that Robert Mitchell was supposed to testify about. Kane had died 5 years ago, but his confession was found in a safety deposit box, along with evidence of several other crimes. Sarah Mitchell and her father finally got their justice, 23 years after they were murdered. Now I know what you're thinking. This is impossible. Dead people don't come back to solve their own murders. Ghosts don't knock on doors and ask for help. And maybe you're right. Maybe I had some kind of breakdown. Maybe the whole thing was a hallucination brought on by stress and guilt over an unsolved case. But I'll tell you what I know for certain. That little girl was real. I felt her cold hand in mine. I saw the pain in her eyes. I heard her voice asking for help. And somehow, through me, she got the justice she deserved. Over the years, I've investigated hundreds of cases. I've seen the worst of humanity and the best. I've learned that truth is often stranger than fiction, and that sometimes the impossible is just another word for miraculous. People ask me if I believe in ghosts now. I tell them I believe in justice. I believe that some wrongs are so terrible that they transcend death itself. And I believe that sometimes, when we make a promise to seek justice for the innocent, that promise becomes more powerful than we ever imagined. 3 years have passed since that morning when Sarah Mitchell knocked on my door. I've never seen her again, but sometimes, when I'm working in my garden or sitting on my porch in the evening, I catch a whiff of that earthy smell, and I know she's at peace. The house is quiet now, filled with the normal sounds of retirement. The tick of the grandfather clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of settling wood. But I listen more carefully now. I pay attention to the unusual sounds, the unexplained moments, the impossible coincidences, because I learned something that day that 40 years of police work couldn't teach me. Sometimes the dead need detectives too. Sometimes justice requires more than evidence and testimony and courtroom verdicts. Sometimes it requires faith in the impossible and the courage to follow a case wherever it leads, even if it leads beyond the boundaries of life and death. And if someday another lost soul finds their way to my door, I'll be ready, because Detective Frank Morrison never truly retires. Some promises are too important to break, and some cases are too important to close. The badge may be in a drawer now, but the oath to serve and protect continues. Even when the victims are beyond protecting, and the only service left is the truth. That's what I learned from the most bizarre case of my career, the case that solved itself, with a little help from beyond the grave.